Hey everyone, welcome back to Book Summaries channel. Today we're diving into a book that flips traditional self-help on its head and teaches us that the key to a better life isn't caring more, it's caring less about the right things. This is The Subtle Art of Not Giving a**ck by Mark Manson, a counterintuitive approach to living a good life that has helped millions of readers worldwide rethink their priorities and find true happiness. Manson opens with the story of Charles Bukowski, a perpetual loser who became successful by embracing his failures rather than hiding from them. The chapter challenges the conventional self-help narrative that constantly pushes us to be positive and achieve more. Manson argues that our culture's obsession with positivity is actually toxic because it makes us feel inadequate when we're not happy all the time. The key insight is that we have a limited amount of care to give, so we must choose what we give our attention to very carefully. Trying too hard to be happy often backfires because it reminds us of what we lack. The pursuit of positive experiences is itself a negative experience, while accepting negative experiences is itself a positive experience. This is what Manson calls the backwards law. The more you desperately want to be rich, the more poor and unworthy you feel. The more you want to be attractive and loved, the lonelier and more unlikable you become. Real change comes from accepting our limitations and choosing better values to care about. Success comes from solving problems, not avoiding them, and we should embrace our struggles rather than run from them. This chapter explores the Buddhist principle that suffering is inevitable and that happiness comes from solving problems, not avoiding them. Manson explains that pain and loss are fundamental parts of human existence that cannot be escaped. The Buddha taught that life itself is suffering, and the only way to find peace is to accept this reality. Problems never stop coming. They simply get exchanged for better problems as we grow. Happiness is not a solvable equation or a permanent state to achieve. Instead, happiness is the process of working through difficulties and finding meaning in the struggle. Manson uses the metaphor of emotions as feedback mechanisms. Like physical pain tells us something is wrong with our body. Negative emotions signal that something needs to change in our lives. Many people make the mistake of either denying problems exist or dwelling on them without taking action. The healthy approach is to acknowledge problems and actively work to solve them. Choosing what to care about, what problems to solve, determines the quality of our lives. We shouldn't seek a life without problems, but should seek better problems to have. The question isn't how do we stop suffering, but what suffering is worth enduring for the life we want to build. Manson tackles the modern epidemic of entitlement and exceptionalism that has been bred into an entire generation. He argues that the self-esteem movement and participation trophy culture have created people who believe they're special without having done anything special. This leads to either inflated egos or crippling insecurity, both rooted in the same problem of feeling entitled to greatness. The reality is that most of us are pretty average at most things, and that's perfectly okay. The obsession with being exceptional actually makes people more miserable because it sets impossible standards. Technology and social media have amplified this by constantly showing us the highlights of everyone else's lives, making us feel inadequate. Manson explains that true self-worth comes from accepting our ordinariness and finding meaning in the mundane. When we accept that we're not special, we're freed from the pressure to prove ourselves constantly. We can focus on improving in areas that genuinely matter to us rather than seeking validation. The key is to be comfortable with being uncomfortable, to accept mediocrity as the starting point for growth. Entitlement isolates us because it demands the world recognize our greatness without us earning it. The path forward is humility and honest self-assessment without the need for constant exceptional outcomes. This chapter examines how our values determine the quality of our suffering and therefore the quality of our lives. Manson introduces the idea that some values are better than others, and choosing poor values leads to poor problems. He identifies bad values as superstitious, socially destructive, or not immediate or controllable, such as pleasure, material success, always being right, and staying positive. These values are problematic because they're either outside our control or inherently shallow. Good values, on the other hand, are reality-based, socially constructive, and immediate and controllable, like honesty, innovation, vulnerability, and standing up for others. Our values are shaped by our experiences, especially painful ones, which often define what we believe is important. When we experience trauma or repeated failures, we often develop unhealthy values as coping mechanisms. The key is to question whether our current values actually serve us or whether they're remnants of past pain. Manson emphasizes that we always have control over what we value, even when we can't control our circumstances. By choosing better values, we choose better problems and therefore better lives. Self-improvement isn't about achieving some perfect state, but about prioritizing better values and metrics for success. The question isn't whether we'll suffer, but for what we're willing to suffer, because that determines everything. Manson explores the concept of radical responsibility, arguing that we're always responsible for our experiences even when we're not at fault for them. He distinguishes between fault and responsibility. Fault is about the past and blame, while responsibility is about the present and action. We may not be at fault for our problems, but we're always responsible for how we respond to them. This chapter challenges victim mentality by asserting that even in terrible circumstances, we maintain the power to choose our reactions. Manson shares the story of William James, who overcame suicidal depression by choosing to believe he had agency over his life. The author argues that many people give away their power by blaming external circumstances for their unhappiness. When we claim we have no choice, we're actually making the choice to be helpless. Taking responsibility is uncomfortable because it means acknowledging our role in our own suffering. However, this discomfort is the price of empowerment and change. Manson addresses common objections to this philosophy, acknowledging that some situations genuinely limit our options. Nevertheless, even in the most constrained circumstances, we maintain the freedom to choose our attitude and values. The ultimate point is that accepting responsibility for everything in our lives, want it or not, is the first step toward changing them. This chapter examines how our brains constantly deceive us and why being wrong is a fundamental part of growth. Manson explains that our memories are unreliable, our perceptions are biased, and our beliefs are often based on incomplete or false information. He introduces the concept that growth requires us to constantly update our beliefs as we encounter new evidence. Many people tie their identity to their beliefs, making it psychologically threatening to admit when they're wrong. This creates intellectual stagnation because they defend outdated ideas rather than evolve. Manson argues that uncertainty is the root of progress, and those who can embrace being wrong learn faster and adapt better. He shares personal examples of times he was completely wrong about major life decisions and relationships. The key is to ask ourselves not what we know, but what we're wrong about, because that's where growth happens. Manson introduces Manson's law of avoidance, which states that the more something threatens your identity, the more you will avoid it. When we build our identity around being right, we can't learn from being wrong. The healthiest approach is to hold our beliefs loosely and update them as we gain new information. This requires humility and the willingness to look foolish or feel uncertain. By accepting that we're wrong about many things, we open ourselves to continuous improvement and deeper understanding. Manson reframes failure as an essential component of success rather than something to avoid. He argues that our society's fear of failure prevents people from taking the risks necessary for meaningful achievement. The chapter explores how successful people aren't those who never fail, but those who fail repeatedly and learn from it. Manson uses the example of Picasso, who created thousands of pieces throughout his career, most of which were mediocre or failures. Success is a numbers game. Improvement requires failure, and we learn more from failures than successes. The pain of failure is what teaches us and helps us calibrate our approach for next time. Many people would rather do nothing than risk failing, which guarantees they'll never succeed at anything meaningful. Manson introduces the concept that action isn't just the result of motivation, but also the cause of it. We often wait to feel motivated before acting, but action creates momentum that generates motivation. This creates a positive feedback loop. Action leads to inspiration, which leads to more action. The do something principle states that when stuck, do anything, because action sparks clarity and motivation. Failure is simply feedback that tells us what adjustments to make. By reframing failure as data rather than defeat, we remove its emotional sting and can use it constructively. The goal isn't to avoid failure, but to fail forward, constantly learning and improving. This chapter explores commitment, boundaries, and how freedom comes from limitations rather than unlimited options. Manson argues that modern culture's obsession with keeping all options open prevents deep satisfaction and meaningful achievement. He uses the example of consumer culture and dating apps to show how endless choice paralyzes us and prevents commitment. Real freedom comes from choosing what to give up, not from having everything available. When we commit to something, whether a relationship, career, or value, we necessarily reject alternatives. This rejection is what gives our choices meaning and depth. Manson discusses how healthy relationships require clear boundaries and the ability to say no. People who can't set boundaries end up resenting others and feeling victimized. Saying no is an expression of our values, defining what we stand for by defining what we won't tolerate. The chapter addresses the fear of missing out and how it prevents people from fully investing in their current choices. Manson argues that depth of experience is more valuable than breadth, that mastering one thing beats dabbling in many. Commitment is scary because it involves sacrifice and the possibility of being wrong. However, without commitment, we float through life without ever fully experiencing anything. The paradox is that by limiting ourselves through commitment, we actually expand our capacity for meaning and achievement. True freedom isn't having unlimited options, but choosing our limitations wisely. The final chapter confronts mortality and how awareness of death gives life meaning. Manson explores how modern society tries to distract us from death through entertainment, achievement, and the pursuit of legacy. He argues that accepting our mortality is essential for living authentically and prioritizing what truly matters. The chapter begins with the story of Ernest Becker and his book The Denial of Death, which argues that all human civilization is essentially an elaborate distraction from our fear of dying. People create conceptual immortality projects, things they hope will outlive them and give their existence permanent meaning. These might be children, businesses, art, or achievements that we hope will be remembered. However, Manson argues that even these will eventually be forgotten, and that's okay. The awareness that everything ends should inform how we choose to spend our limited time. Death is the great equalizer that makes all other problems seem small in comparison. When we truly internalize our mortality, petty concerns and ego-driven pursuits lose their grip on us. Manson shares how confronting death has helped him clarify his values and focus on what matters most. He argues that without death, nothing would matter because there would be no scarcity or urgency. The chapter concludes that the best way to live is to embrace our insignificance in the grand scheme while finding personal meaning in our temporary existence. By accepting that we're just a small blip in cosmic history, we're freed to make our blip meaningful on our own terms without needing external validation or permanent legacy.